Welcome to the Introduction to Verbal Behavior. I'm LKruse, and our lecture objectives are to define verbal behavior and as an operant. So we're going to look at the verbal operants based on Skinner's book in 1957. We'll define convergent and divergent control. We'll define formal and thematic control, joint control, and then also look at faulty stimulus control. We're also going to look at derived relational responding and specifically looking at stimulus equivalence, naming, relational frame theory, and kind of the difference between taught and derived responding, and then look at the different relational frame families. Then we're going to do a brief discussion on Skinner's verbal behavior versus relational frame theory, and kind of what the difference is and the arguments for kind of Skinner's definition of verbal behavior, and then what relational frame theory says and whether or not we need a new definition of verbal behavior. So verbal behavior, Skinner defined verbal behavior as behavior which is mediated through social reinforcement. Instead of defining verbal behavior by its parts of speech, which is what some of his contemporaries were doing, he defined it by how it functions as part of that speaker-listener relationship. So this allowed it to fit kind of within behaviorism and that focus on function of behavior. So he then classified behavior into the different operants. So we're going to review those operants now. So this chart kind of summarizes the main verbal operants. We do have listener responding on there now, which is not a verbal operant per se, but we include it because that listener response is kind of a crucial component of Skinner's verbal behavior. So a mand is antecedent by a motivating operation. So you want something. It's basically a request. The consequence is you get that desired item and activity and it has to be given to you somehow. So when you're hungry, you say, I want pizza. The social reinforcement part comes in as you wouldn't say, I want pizza necessarily if pizza was sitting right there and you could just get it yourself. So if you're at a restaurant, you may say, I would like pizza in order to let the listener know that's what you want for dinner. A tact is a physical stimuli, is the antecedent. So you see, touch, somehow experience a stimuli. And it's basically, it's a label in layman's terms. So that generalized conditioned social reinforcement is the reinforcer. So we label things because of the response we get from others. So when you see a familiar piece of art, you might say it's a Picasso to impress, say your date at the art museum. The echoic has a verbal stimuli as the antecedent. It's basically repeating a heard verbalization. So it's that same generalized conditioned social reinforcement. So if you're learning a new language, you may do lots of echoic behavior. The teacher points to the sun, says el sol, then you would repeat el sol to help you learn it. The next is intraverbal, which is there's a verbal stimuli. However, the verbal response does not match that stimuli. So in the echoic, there's a point-to-point correspondence. So you hear el sol, you say el sol. In an intraverbal, it may be how do you say the sun in Spanish, and the response then, the intraverbal response would be el sol. Or how are you? And the response is I'm great. Textual is there's a visual stimuli as the antecedent, and so it's basically just reading. So at a restaurant, you see the specials board, you might read it out loud. The transcription is you get an auditory stimuli and you write down what was spoken to you. And so when told, to get some stuff at the store, you may make a list so that you don't forget anything. Autoclitic is kind of not researched very much and you don't hear about it very often, but it's words or phrases that kind of quantify or qualify a response. So it's things like I think, I feel that. It's kind of those adjective adverbs that really let you know if it's a fact or I know versus I think. And then your listener skills, that's your following directions kind of ability. When told to sit, you sit down. There are some extensions on these, so we'll review some of the common ones. Mand extensions, they're superstitious mands. So this is a man that's kind of under faulty stimulus control. We have all done these when we yell at a sports game to, telling them what they need to do. So requesting, them to hit the home run. Even though we know that that might not actually make them hit the home run, we've kind of developed this behavior because one time when we did it, they hit the home run. And then a magical mand is one that may never actually happen. So I wish I could fly. Things like that where you're kind of saying things like, it would be great if I could, read minds. Where you're never going to be able to access that reinforcement. But you still say it anyways. For tact extensions, so your labeling extensions, we have a generic. So technically the tact itself is just, you see the one thing, you know that one thing, that cup is a cup. Do you know other cups are cups? So a generic extension is where the defining features are all present, and so you see a dog and then they can label dog to other dogs. Metaphoric extension, where some but not all, so there's a little bit of kind of stimulus control issues here, where so a dog has 4 legs and ears, a kid sees a cat and may call that a dog because it does have some of those defining features. And metonymy, it's the defining feature may not be present, but the child has, or the person has learned kind of other irrelevant features that may not be necessary without the defining characteristics. So a kid learns to tact dog, and then some dogs, the dog that they learned on has long tongue. So now they see a lion with the long tongue and they call it a dog. And solistic is an extreme generalization, so where the defining features aren't present at all. So at least in the lion example, there were still the 4 legs and ears. They just associated the long tongue instead of the other features. In this extension, it is not even relevant. So the child just learns to tact dog with their black lab at home, and then they see a person with black hair and they say dog, for example. So let's do a little bit of a quiz. Can you figure out what verbal operands are happening in kind of this everyday example? So let's go through it. Laura, Richard, and their little boy John attended the Formula One races this past weekend. John loved all types of vehicles. Every time an airplane flew overhead, John said plane as he pointed at it. So what type of operand is that? Be a generic tact, because at least a tact, and if he had never seen that particular airplane yet, but was able to still know it was an airplane, then it would be a generic extension. When a helicopter flew over, John yelled plane, given it was flying. Also a tact, except for that would be a metaphoric extension because it did have many of the right characteristics, but it was not actually an airplane. His dad corrected him. A plane has wings and a helicopter has blades that spin, so kind of giving those defining characteristics. That's a helicopter. Richard pointed at the helicopter overhead. Helicopter, John said excitedly. So when John says helicopter, what is that? That would be he's echoing what his dad said. It could also be considered kind of a type of a tact now that he's labeling it too. Then it was time for the qualifying races. They grabbed a blanket and went to a good place to sit. John, go get your toy car and come here. John grabbed the white toy car and joined his parents. So what is John's behavior an example of? The listener skill. So he was given a verbal direction and he complied. As they started to walk, John whined, I'm hungry, I want fruit snacks. What would I want fruit snacks be? It's a basic demand. They ran back to the car to grab the snack and made it back to the lawn just in time for the start. As the cars lined up, Laura said, on your mark, get set, and John yelled, go, as the cars took off. So with the antecedent of on your mark, get set, and then John filling in go, what would that be? An intraverbal, because the verbal stimuli does not match the verbal response, yet they do go together. Lewis Hamilton set a new record, but Richard said, I still do not think Hamilton is the best driver. I predict he will lose tomorrow. That is your autoclitics. So he's saying, I do not think. So he's kind of qualifying that it's not that he will for sure lose, but he's predicting he will. He doesn't think he's that good. After qualifying, Laura read aloud what one of the big screens posted. Sunday opening ceremonies, 12:30 p.m. So what would that reading aloud be considered? There you go. It's a textual. If opening ceremonies are at 12:30, what time do you want to leave the house, Laura asked Richard. 10 a.m., he responded. What is that an example of? It's one we've already had. It's an interverbal, where the verbal stimuli does not match. It's not a point-to-point correspondence with the response. She wrote down 10 a.m. in her calendar. And that final one is transcription. So looking at multiple controls. So we know language would be nice if it was always that simple, but it's definitely not. So for convergent control, so things are converging together, joining together, multiple variables can all lead to the same response. So for example, I'm working on teaching my son to say mama. Today we practice him echoing mama, saying mama when we look at a picture of me, and saying mama when he wants me to pick him up. So you've got your say mama, you're echoic, pointing to a picture, so him labeling mama, and using mama as a man to be picked up. So there's multiple things that lead to him saying that same response of mama. And then divergent multiple control is kind of the reverse of that in some senses. It's one variable that leads to multiple responses. So I told my husband I was hungry. So based on kind of what his MO is, there could be multiple responses. He could tell me, let's meet for dinner. He could say, I'll stop at the store and get something for us. Or he could tell me if he was not hungry because he had just eaten, he could say, well, eat something then. For looking at kind of types of control, we've got formal control and thematic control. So formal control is with point-to-point correspondence, essentially. So when you are copying something from a book exactly, as opposed to writing a summary of what you copied. So formal control is that exact, your exact echoic, your exact, here's what it said in the book, I'm copying that exact quote. Thematic control, where it's still evokes a response, but the point-to-point's not seen. So coming to my son, you're petting your puppy versus you're petting your dog to the real dog. So there's not that point-to-point exactly. Conditional discriminants, so let's look at them in a couple of the verbal operants. So within an interverbal, you're going to look at, for convergent control, you could say that all different WH questions which affect the response given. So we're all looking at, for dinner, dinner is kind of that single thing, and then we're looking at all the different responses it can be and what kind of determines those. So different WH questions can affect that response. So dinner could lead to Italian food, it could lead to Olive Garden, it could lead to 6 p.m., dependent upon that other stimuli, which is going to be your WH. So what do you want to eat for dinner? I want Italian. Where do you want to eat dinner? I want to eat at Olive Garden. When do you want to eat dinner? Let's eat at 6 p.m. So divergent would be kind of being able to name a number of options. So where should we go for Italian? They could be Olive Garden, Nick's, Sienna. It could be all different places that could come from that one question. So that's your divergent. Within kind of impure tax, what we're kind of looking at is, what they talk about with impure tax is how you may change kind of the actual label you give something based on kind of their own experiences or what you're kind of attempting to, the point you're attempting to get across. So for convergent, the audience can alter that tax. So if it's someone that I want to visit, so here's your convergent, I may say, oh, and it's nice and sunny here in the summer, even when it's super hot. Whereas if I don't want that person to visit, I might say it's sweltering, because they both have kind of different connotations there. Divergent control, so how's the weather? Here's where you get multiple responses. I could say hot, I could say warm, I could say nice and sunny, I could say sweltering. Joint control is when two discriminative stimuli, which are often different operants, exert control over a shared response. So both of them kind of play an imperative role. So the common example is kind of attacked plus an echoic, which allows us to do that self-rehearsal. So at a party, somebody may label someone attacked and say, hey, that's Mike over there. I might repeat Mike to myself. Oh, his name's Mike. Got to make sure I meet him. His name's Mike. And then when I get a chance to meet him, I'm able to say, oh, hi, you must be Mike, because of combining those two things. So my ability to then introduce myself to him with his name is under joint control of that tact and the echoic. Now, faulty stimulus control. We see this happen quite often. We'll kind of go through a couple of the different operants and see how it looks in the different operants. So for mands, manning for missing items may be absent with faulty stimulus control. So if you see a bowl of cereal without a spoon, a person or a child may say want cereal instead of spoon because they're used to the bowl being how their cue, their SD to ask for cereal, and not realizing that really it's the bowl and the spoon together is what allows them to actually eat the cereal functionally. For tax, faulty stimulus control may occur when an irrelevant stimuli becomes that controlling variable. So if you're trying to teach shapes to a child and you keep showing them a blue square and teach them square, that means square. Generic tact, then the child would tact any blue shape as square because they've now identified square as the color as opposed to the shape. And so they did not attach, the stimulus control was not with the right variable or right stimuli. Metaphoric extension, the child tacks any shape with four sides of square, whether it's a diamond or a rectangle. Although they're there, it's not sufficient. It was not four sides that are all equal. And then the other one would be anything that's blue. So they just overgeneralize it. Anything blue is square. So they've identified with that blue part. For echoics, it could occur when there's some things such as a hearing impediment. So which leads to a speech impediment. So my little brother had a speech impediment due to ear infections as a child, and so if you asked him to say Santa Claus, he'd say Winneta. So there was definitely some faulty stimulus control going on there. For listener discrimination skills, it can occur if, for example, you always put the correct answer on the right-hand side, so they always pick that one, or they learn that mom, if they're tacting, that mom is, the one with the picture on the right instead of actually learning who mom is. So they can touch that one. They always just touch the picture on the right. For interverbals, it may occur if don't have all of those portions of the SD controlling the response. So we talked about it in one of the prior examples about the influence of WH, the different questions on kind of the same topic. So about with dinner, where do you go to dinner? When do you go to dinner? What do you want for dinner? And how those alter the response then you should give for the interverbal. And so if both the topic so in this example down here, the sleep and the WH question are being able to be discriminated, you may get the same response. Instead of where do you go to sleep in my bed versus when do you go to sleep when I'm tired, they may just give the same answer to both. So they may only respond to go to sleep and just say in my bed for both questions. So looking at derived responding, this is kind of building off verbal behavior and people felt like Skinner's verbal behavior just wasn't explaining enough. And how are we then able to say things we've never heard before and put things together and come up with this novel language? So we're going to look at three different kind of theories that have been built off of that. So we have stimulus equivalence, naming, and relational frame theory. So stimulus equivalence, Sidman's was the main researcher and kind of the main guy behind this. It's said to occur when a novel stimulus or stimuli relationship is identified without being taught explicitly. So there's three types that he did a lot of research on: reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity. Reflexivity is when knowing A equals A. So once you've taught a stimulus once, then you can match it to the matching stimuli, the same stimuli. So match to sample. This also kind of explains that one trial learner concept of once you've learned it, you don't have to be taught every single time. Again, that scissors are scissors. You've learned that those are scissors, so I don't need to tell you every single time that they're scissors. It's kind of that maintenance. And you can remember reflexivity by yourself in the mirror or kind of that way. Symmetry is if A is B, then B is A. So if you know that a dog is an animal, then a type of animal is a dog. Transitivity then is, and these are all represented in math too, so a lot of you probably heard of them through math. If A equals B and B equals C, then A should equal C. So let's look at a couple examples and see if we can figure out the type of equivalence being shown. My son loves apples. After he dropped one apple in the toilet, I told him to go find another apple. He was able to point to another apple on the counter. That's an example of that reflexivity. So the apples all look the same. They're all same red delicious. He could do that match to sample. A little girl wanted to go to her dance class, which was in the morning, but it was art in the afternoon. Her mom told her they couldn't go to dance class because it was the afternoon. They had already had lunch. The little girl replied, "But I didn't eat my lunch today, so I can still go to dance." Oh, the beauty of kid logic. That is an example of transitivity. I apologize. So if A is B and B equals C, then A equals C. So dance class is in the morning. The morning is before you eat lunch. So if I didn't eat lunch, then it's dance class time. And the last example, a student who learns that 2 times 4 equals 8 is able to answer that what 4 times 2 equals without additional training. That's your symmetry. So A then B, then B, then A. And these are often things that we see as kind of deficits in particularly individuals on the autism spectrum with other developmental delays. So naming, what is naming? It's something we all say, oh, the name of that is. We all kind of recognize the layman's terms, but from a technical term, it's the assignment of a label to a person, place, or thing. And it doesn't require that conditioning necessarily, but it does require that an echoic, particularly self-echoic, tact, and listener behaviors have all been established. And so being able then to, once you've established all those, then you can kind of use it throughout the operants and transfer between operants without additional training. So it's able to, they tell you go get a cup. You can get the cup, you can label a cup, and you can say cup to yourself. You can echo cup. So Miguel, who did a lot of the work on naming, he does describe 2 different types, so common naming, intraverbal naming. So common naming is just kind of what we think of as that regular, just the name of this thing is, it's a bed, it's a car. Intraverbal naming is more the association of things that may go together, and that may be where you get some more of that generative language. So, a shovel and a pail, a sock and a shoe, that you kind of associate these things through this naming process. So let's do a quick check of skills. Can you figure out which is naming? So my son's favorite toy is a pull toy dog that we call Puppy. At home, we may tell him, go find Puppy. He runs about the house until he finds it. When he finds it, he shouts Puppy. He also is able to say puppy, puppy, puppy once he finds it over and over. The other example, so one of these is naming, one does not qualify as naming. My husband struggles with foreign languages. When we travel to other countries, he typically uses gestures to communicate. When eating dinner, he may point to something another patron has. When the waiter says camarón, my husband echoes camarón. He is then surprised when shrimp arrives instead of the fish that he was pointing at. So some faulty stimulus control there as well, potentially, but which one of these 2 is naming? So the first one, he can echo puppy, he labels puppy, he can go do the listener skill of finding the puppy when it's named. And the example with my husband does not fall under naming because he was not able to, all he had was kind of the echoic. He was not able to label it nor receptively identify it. So let's look at relational frame theory. Relational frame theory, it's a newer kind of response to Skinner's verbal behavior, and it theorizes that language and cognition are due to the ability to relate between things. So it's all about that relational responding. It's kind of an advanced form in some senses of stimulus equivalence, you could think of it, and so it really argues that Skinner's definitions are not sufficient. Language is too complex. We're able to do too many things that cannot be just explained by those basic verbal operants. Its core units are kind of non-arbitrary and arbitrary relations. So non-arbitrary relies on the physical properties. So 3 balls put in size, an order size will do so pretty naturally. In one of the trainings that I did when I was learning about this, they would just put up 3 different pictures of something that were different sizes and say, here, just put these in order without giving any other direction. And a large percentage of people will just naturally put them in that size order. So those physical stimuli. It could be a gradient from light to dark, anything that's just kind of that natural physical stimuli. Arbitrary relations don't rely on the physical stimuli. So it could have to do, it's something that we've learned, essentially. It's been learned or derived or taught. It's not something that we can just look at it and go off of. It kind of is based on some of our history. So when asked to put math, social studies, and art in order, you may order them differently based on your learning history. So it could be how you had them in school, if you remember your school schedule still. You could just put them alphabetically. You could put them by your preference order, difficulty. There's a variety of ways that you could do it. Let's do a couple basic examples of arbitrary versus non-arbitrary relational responding. So looking at putting coins in order. So when asked to put coins in order, there's kind of 2 pretty obvious ways. So Sam puts them like this. He goes dime, penny, nickel, quarter. Sarah, on the other hand, puts them penny, nickel, dime, quarter. So which one is arbitrary and which one is non-arbitrary? First one would be non-arbitrary. So it's put in order of size. It's just that basic physical characteristic. And therefore, the second one is arbitrary. It's the value order, which is something that is learned. So let's look at kind of Skinner's definitions of things versus RFTs and kind of looking at taught, what has to be taught, what is an example of something been taught versus something that's been derived. So for your manager request, Skinner said it's a verbal behavior under control of conditions of deprivation, which is reinforced then by a characteristic consequence related to the man but does not have that point-to-point. Now, RFT defines nonverbal and verbal, and nonverbal, a man that's been explicitly reinforced, and verbal is a man that participates in relational frames. So they define basically is there's that taught, which is the nonverbal, and then the verbal, which is the part that does the derived in the relational frames. So verbal man participates in relational frames such as toy, which could mean block, ball, toy car, green army man, etc. So let's look at a couple examples of taught or derived. So John says snack when he's hungry. When he's offered pretzels, he turns them down and keeps saying snack, 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 snack until he's given fruit snacks. And the other example is he says snack when he's hungry. When his mom doesn't respond fast enough, he goes through the drawers and pulls out some pretzels and Teddy Grahams. So which one is which? The first one is taught. So he's taught that fruit snacks is called snack. Very point to point, pretty explicit. Not necessarily that related to each other. And then the other one is going to be your derived. So snack means a variety of things. It's kind of evidence of a category of things. For the echoic, point-to-point correspondence, as Skinner defines it, from an auditory stimulus to the verbal behavior. It's socially reinforced and it's needed for that initial language acquisition, but we do maintain it into adulthood. For RFT, it's just the vocal correspondence, so just parroting back and forth. And verbal, for RFT, it's participating in kind of additional relational frames. So taught versus derived. Let's do our little mini quiz here. I send my husband to the store to get eggs, milk, and sugar. On the way, he repeats to himself, eggs, flour, sugar, eggs, flour, sugar. Oh, maybe she can make cookies. I should get milk. So he's taking the ingredients that I told him and thinking about the other things that I typically say with those things. And so he's echoing and then adding on an additional echoic. When I label something as orange, which is my favorite color, my son now attempts to say orange, which is pretty exciting. So it gets him hugs and kisses from me. So that first one, he's deriving the additional things that he hears me typically say with that list of ingredients to another one. And in the orange example, he's just point to point. I say orange, he says orange. He gets that social reinforcement. So let's look at entailments. Entailments they're kind of similar to the stimulus equivalents, except they're more relational instead of just equivalent. So mutual entailment is when the relation is bidirectional. So which one does that sound like? That kind of symmetry. So if A is to B, then B is to A. If John is taller than Trey, then Trey is shorter than John. So it can have that comparison aspect to it also. So it has, what is that relation between the two things? And then in this example, we'll go over the relational frame families next, but it's kind of an opposition frame. The next one is more along that lines of the transitivity. So combinatorial entailment is when two or more stimuli relationships combine to entail a third. So if John is taller than Richard, and Richard is taller than Laura, then John is taller than Laura. I didn't have to explicitly tell you that last one. You were able to derive it. Many of you, I'm sure, can remember those logic puzzles you used to get in elementary school to work through, where you had to chart it all out and figure out who did what where. This is what relational frame theory is attempting to explain, is how do we derive all those relationships? And then the final one that they have that they talk about is this transformation of function. I will admit this one took me a little while to get the hang of, and really when it says transformation of function, you have to kind of change it in your head and think change of meaning. So when it's psychological perceptual functions of a stimuli or meanings of a stimuli change its function or change its meaning. So when you see a snake at the science center, that might motivate you to kind of read about snakes more. But when you see a snake, if I saw a snake in my toilet, that would be my motivation to move out of Texas immediately. Um, so the seeing a snake, you do not always have the same response based on the context. So let's look at these different types of entailment and see, is it mutual, combinatorial, or are we looking at a transformation of function? So when learning about Iwata in class, hopefully you guys all know Iwata, I learned that behavior is 4 functions: escape, attention, tangible, and automatic. When I learned about functions while studying RFT, the word function means meaning. So which one does that fall under? That would be a transformation of function. So the word function itself changes meanings based on the context in which I am discussing it. Next one, Sarah is learning about mealtime. She knows that breakfast is before lunch. She can now tell you that lunch is after breakfast. Which one is that? It could be that mutual entailment. So it goes both ways, that bidirectionality. So, and this one is going to be when we go over the frame families, kind of the temporal. So it's looking at the time of before, after. When also told that dinner is after lunch, Sarah can now tell you that dinner is after breakfast and breakfast is before dinner. So which one is that? Yep, the combinatorial entailment. So now it's the A and B. A is related to B and B is related to C. That allows you to derive how A and C are related. So we keep mentioning them. Let's go into the relational frame families now. We're going to go over kind of the big main ones, and we'll do a little quiz on them. For coordination, so A is the same as B. It looks at sameness or equivalence. Distinction is going to look at A is not the same as B. So they're not equivalent. So a bird, an eagle is a bird. A rat is not a bird, but that does not allow you to do that combinatorial if you keep going. Opposition is going to be the opposite of. So A is the opposite of B, and A is the opposite of C. And then that actually will allow you to say that potentially B is the same as C. So that's kind of that relational frame, is using the opposite of. If the red on the stove, on the water faucet, does not mean, hot, is the opposite of hot and cold. So you do like red and blue and hot and cold, then you could know just some of them and you could figure out the other components. For comparison, that's kind of all your superlatives. So, or superlatives, I apologize. Comparison dimensions: faster, taller, smarter. Spatial is related to positions in space. So closer, farther away, near. Hierarchical is relation to classes. So a dog is, or Athena is a dog, and a dog is a mammal. So Athena is a mammal, so that they're inclusive of. Temporal is a relation to time. So A comes before B, so therefore B comes after A. Causal is causing one or the other. So the fire happens because of the match. So, one is an effect of the other. And then dialectic is related to the perspective of the speaker. So left, right, my husband and I always do that because he always does it in relation to him, and if I'm across from him, he forgets to switch left and right. I, you, so those tricky ones where they really require that perspective. And this is one that we definitely, in kind of the autism population, will see a large deficit in. You always hear about the pronoun reversal. That's kind of, this explains that a little bit. Or the deficit in this is what kind of leads to that. So let's go through a common example and see if we can figure out what relational frames are happening. Sally was at the store with her mom. They needed to pick out a toy for some friends' birthday parties. Let's go to the back of the store, her mom said. So let's go to the back of the store. Which relational frame is that one? That would be your spatial, so location-based. On the walk back, Sally saw some dolls. I want these. These are American Girl dolls. I don't have them yet. Which one would that be? Your hierarchical is American Girl dolls are a class of items which then have component pieces under them. Sally, your birthday is after Beckett and Allie's birthdays. We need to get their presents first. How about that one? That'd be your temporal, so that's your time before and after. So if your birthday's after theirs, um, therefore theirs comes before yours. You could potentially look at the dialectic since it has the your in there, but temporal is really the main component of this one. They continued to the back of the store where the bikes were. Beckett is taller than Allie, so he needs a bigger bike. The Beckett is taller than Allie is definitely a comparison between the two kids. And then the he needs a bigger bike could potentially be a little bit more on that coordination of if he's taller, he needs bigger. Allie likes purple, not yellow, said Sally as they picked out a bike for Allie. So what is that? That's your distinction, that not. So she does not like yellow. On the way back to the front, they passed the American Girl dolls again. Sally, pick one out now, but you cannot have it now. You must wait until it's your birthday. That falls more to that dialectic. So looking at that relation to oneself. So just touching again on that generation of novel language. So humans, kind of trying to put it all together a little bit, humans have developed the ability to generate language and to generate language forms which they have not heard. I remember when I first heard that, I thought that was the most fascinating thing I'd ever heard, that a child can generate a sentence they've never heard before, and just how impressive that is. So within the world of behaviorism, there's a couple leading theories on how language really is generated. So Skinner's verbal behavior really provided the foundation for the following: the stimulus equivalence that we talked about, the naming concept, and then relational frame theory as well. And these additional three approaches really attempted to expand on Skinner's work and provide what they considered a better explanation for that complexity that is human language. Okay, we're going to look at a crazy chart, try to break it down quickly, and then wrap up. So let's look at those three different approaches then. So you have RFT, which the analytical units are that non-arbitrary and arbitrary relational responding. So they look at relational frames, kind of listed out in the properties, and the entailment, as well as RFT looks at that transformation of functions. So RFT is really all about how we use language and the aspect of context within language. Naming just looks more at kind of the bidirectional relations between things. So in order to engage in naming, you need to show what we all consider understanding. So you have to have the listener skill, the tact skill, the self-echoic, and show really that full understanding. Naming, while it doesn't do the specific transfer of function or transformation of function, it does allow for transference between verbal operands. So once you've kind of have the ability to name something, you can transfer between it, as you can ask for it now, you can label it, you can use it as part of an interverbal, you can echo it, you can follow direction with it in there. So it allows for kind of transferring between verbal operands somewhat. Stimulus equivalence has the conditional discrimination, so being able to discriminate between things, and the equivalence relations. So those equivalence relations is that transitivity, reflexivity, and symmetry. And I apologize, those are swapped. So reflexivity is the A equals A, and symmetry is the A equals B and B equals A. And the transfer of function is where equivalence relations allow a word to be used in response to an untrained stimuli and have the same meaning. So example is, if I'm told something is a puppy, when I see a puppy, I can now label it a puppy. So kind of I'm given that, that's where you see kind of build off of that naming, or naming build off of it. I'm told this is a puppy, now I can use puppy as the label. So the bigger controversy, stimulus equivalence really kind of built off what Skinner said, and Skinner kind of had alluded to it in his original work as well, and naming kind of branched off that still, but RFT really is trying to kind of presents itself, although based in behaviorism, a much different definition of verbal behavior. So one of the big differences is on how they kind of define how language is formed, and that Skinner really, it requires those contingencies of reinforcement. So it requires that three-term contingency, whereas RFT, while it doesn't say it can't happen, it does not require it, and it's very much just based on relational responding. However, there have been multiple papers that show that the theories can blend together. So one key point they kind of make is that instead of just the verbal events requiring absence, they don't require that there not be reinforcement. They just require those arbitrarily applicable relational responding to occur. RFT also kind of defines and stresses the difference between nonverbal and verbal for each of the operants. Um, and so nonverbal is when the response does not participate in relational frames, and verbal is where it does. So what they're trying to basically say is that verbal behavior has meaning behind it. So it's not just the parroting, but it's doing something with that parroting. It's considered to have those additional kind of psychological functions, which really is meaning that the context affects the way we use language. So it's kind of the big question then, is a new definition of verbal behavior necessary? Those who argue yes say that Skinner's verbal behavior is just much too broad and it doesn't explain the complexity of language, that a better definition should be able to explain how novel language is generated. They also argue that it doesn't take context and cognition really into account. One thing I thought was really interesting in it was some of the arguments looked at that what we define as intelligence perhaps is how quickly we are able to engage in this relational responding. So those who say we don't need a new definition is those who say, Skinner's verbal behavior provides a very clear foundation, and it fits within behaviorism since it does require that kind of three-term contingency and those reinforcement contingencies. Skinner did acknowledge that there is expansion necessary. So he did mention about, the need for kind of that equivalence training potentially, and how we can, things like multiple exemplar training and how then that can allow us to generalize more. And one of the arguments against kind of RFT is that it's described in a way that makes it really hard to prove that it's wrong, which can be kind of frustrating. And if you can't prove a theory wrong, then is it really a valid theory? So one of the big pushes, if you look at a lot of literature, is about can they be combined harmoniously or not? And so Freiling looked at whether it discusses where with verbal behavior, is it really a unique type of behavior or not? Or is it just behavior? And it just functions the same way, and so we've just kind of done these extra operants to provide a little bit extra explanation, but really verbal behavior is just behavior. Leigland suggests that Skinner's definition is just incomplete, and it doesn't fully explain what that social history he's referring to entails. And so these additional theories have kind of helped provide and fill in those holes. Norman also pointed out that critics have issues with the requirements of another organism in that three-term contingency, then they should have issue with all social behaviors. So pretty much everything but really automatic reinforcement often requires a listener, a social partner. And so if they have issues with the fact that there's reinforcement built into verbal behavior, then that should apply to other behaviors such as social behaviors. And then Palmer discusses how RFT's entailment could potentially just be an extension of stimulus equivalence. So it expands, so it's not just A equals B, then B equals C, but if A relates to B and B relates to C, then A relates to C, and so that's how the relation is learned. And RFT does add a needed relational expansion to Sidman's stimulus equivalence, but does that really mean we have to rename it as a novel concept? I think there's already a little bit of that issue in our field with Skinner's verbal operants as it is calling it a demand instead of just saying a request. And so do we really need to add a whole new definition in there when we could just kind of combine the two and show how they together can create a full picture of how we generate language? And here are the references. There's page 1 and page 2. Thank you very much.